Honorable Vice Chancellor Krishna Kanta State Open University, distinguished guests, invited speakers, students, colleagues, and my dear friends. I, Trisha Dwara Borua, take this opportunity to welcome you all on behalf of Krishna Kanta State Open University to the 12th Foundation Day Lecture of Jnan Taranga, the community radio station of this university. The role of community radio is to respond to the priorities set by the community, to facilitate their discussions on issues confronting them, and to reinforce their social development agenda through communication. With formal broadcasting beginning on 20th of November 2010, this particular radio station remains ever committed to facilitating and acknowledging the creative spirit which would go a long way in building a knowledge society. Before moving any further, I'd like to request all present here to kindly rise for the university's song. Invite our Honorable Vice Chancellor of Krishna Kanta State Open University and advisor for today's Foundation Day program, Professor Rajendra Prasad Das, to the dais and kindly occupy the chair. With equal pleasure, I would like to invite a distinguished speaker for today's occasion, Professor Vinod Pavarala, Professor and UNESCO Chair on Community Media, University of Hyderabad, to kindly occupy the chair on the dais. Again, I'd like to invite the Registrar of Krishna Kanta State Open University, Dr. Rojuti Chaudhary, to kindly occupy the dais. I'd also like to invite Dr. Sangeeta Kakoti, the convener of the program and Deputy Director, Electronic Media Production Center, and Station Manager, Jnan Taranga Community Radio Station, to the dais and kindly occupy the seat. The chief guest for today's occasion, Mr. P.J. Borwa, he's on his way, so he'll be joining us in another 5-10 minutes. Moving forward, we would like to begin the event by paying homage to Ma Saraswati and lighting the ceremonial lamp. I take the honor of requesting a distinguished speaker and to offer tribute to Ma Saraswati and light the ceremonial lamp. Also, I'd like to request the dignitaries present on the dais to kindly accompany them and take part in the proceeding. For this, I'd like to request Dr. Jury Hazarika to assist. Thank you. May I now request our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Sir, to felicitate our distinguished invited speaker, Professor Vinod Pavarala, with a full-on gamusa and a japi on behalf of the university. I'd like to request Dr. Sukmaya Lama to assist Honorable Vice Chancellor, sir. Now, I would like to request the Registrar of the University, Dr. Orujyoti Chaudhary, to felicitate the Vice Chancellor of Krishna Kanta Handik State Open University with a full-on gamusa and a japi on our behalf. For this purpose, I'd like to request Ms. Gitanjali Medhi to assist Registrar, sir. Now I'd like to request the convener of the program, Dr. Sangeeta Kakoti, to felicitate the Registrar of the University. For this purpose, I'd like to request Dr. Jury Hazarika to assist Registrar. May I now request Ms. Ritu Gogo, who is presently engaged with the Jnan Taranga radio station, to felicitate the convener of today's Foundation Day lecture with a full-on gamusa and a japi on our behalf. I'd like to request Dr. Sukmaya Lama to assist Ms. Gogo. Thank you. Now I'd like to request Dr. Sangeeta Kakoti convener of the Jnan Taranga Foundation Day Lecture, and Deputy Director, Electronic Media Production Center and Station Manager, Jnan Taranga Community Radio Station, to deliver the welcome address.
A very good morning to one and all present over here. Honorable Vice Chancellor of this university, Professor Rajendra Prasad Das, invited speaker of the day, Professor Binod Pavarala, chief guest of the program, Prasanta Jyoti Borua, Registrar Dr. Arupjyoti Chaudhary, esteemed member of the Radio Advisory Committee, directors of different schools, officers and faculty members, our community of volunteers and their valuable listeners, invited guests, media persons, students from different organizations, and everyone present over here. First of all, I, on behalf of the organizing committee, welcome all of you to this 12th Foundation Day celebration of our community radio Jnan Taranga, which is the first community radio station in Northeast India, patronized by Krishnakanta Handicap State Open University. It was established in the year 2010. I am very thankful to the authority for giving us this opportunity to celebrate with you all. Today we have completed 12 years of our radio journey. It was established to fulfill one of the university's motto, to reach the unreached and to provide a common platform to the marginalized sections of the society. As a concept on which community radio established is that community radio is for the community and by the community. Keeping this always in mind, the Jnan Taranga Radio has been broadcasting various community-based programs from its inception, basically on the subjects like health, sports, career, science, women issues, children, agriculture, horticulture, etc., etc. It always tries to provide a platform for the community, trying to provide a space to the community for further interaction, discussion on various important issues of the community and for the development of the society. With this aim, Jnan Taranga has launched a number of programs which have clear-cut impact on different sections of the society. The programs like Jubo Tirtha reflects the focus on the youth. At the same time, the programs like Sahitya Sora, Sanskriti, Borenno, Puharar Bat, Monor Khobor, Gyan Khofura, Hiku Tirtha all reflects the focus given to that of the various sections of the society. Now to find out the issues of surrounding communities, compiling and producing and monitoring the programs, and to handle all necessary technical equipments like computer system, internet, console operations, speaking in front of the microphone, etc., etc., and operate the studio on time, we engage some selected 11 responsible volunteers to represent various communities. We are thankful that they all do their responsibility very well by following all the guidelines and all the regulations of broadcasting that guided by the ministry. One important point I just would like to share with you all that though the aerial distance of our community radio is 30 kilometers of radius, to connect more audience, we last year added another wing to its head by starting internet radio facility, and this is a global internet platform, iradiolive.com, so that the programs can be listened from anywhere and at any time. And this is a huge advantage for the listeners, as anything of their importance can be extracted from its content. One another motto of the community radio is to provide voice to the voiceless. Yes, we can very proudly say that we have succeeded in this area because we have lots of success stories too. One very important success story I would just like to share with you all that Mr. Honto Kolita, he is present here also today. He was first a regular listener of us, and now he became the volunteer community volunteers and producing one special program, Heuji Dhoroni, for our studio. And again, his son, he's associated with us from since 6 to 7 years. He is also producing one program, Hihu Titha. This is very significant for us, for our university, that they are providing space for the voiceless one. Recently, the station is doing many awareness programs in collaboration with many government and non-government organizations like UNICEF, UNESCO, SEMCA, Ayush Mantranalaya, then MSME, National Skill Development Committee, Disaster Management Authority, etc. I feel very proud to share with you that Jnan Taranga Community Radio Station is now the life member of the Community Radio Association India. The station is carrying out several activities like conducting workshops, providing internship training to the students of other educational institutions, and many more. You can view all these activities from the 12 years of journey from the docu film that produced by the EMPC division. I request Utpal to play the video, please, for you all. Thank you very much for hearing.
আমি জনাবলৈ পাই সুখী হৈছো যে আজি জ্ঞান তৰংগ কমিউনিটি ৰেডিঅ' কেন্দ্ৰৰ দ্বাদশ প্ৰতিষ্ঠা দিৱস উদযাপন কৰিব লৈছে। আহকচোন এই উপলক্ষে আমি উভতি যাওঁ এৰি অহা দিনবোৰৰ কিছুমান বিশেষ মুহূৰ্তলৈ। Community radio is a medium of expressing and sharing views, thoughts, ideas, problems, and prospects of rural, disadvantaged, and the vulnerable. Community radio has become popular in recent years, and it has opened a new arena for both the policymakers as well as grassroots people to be involved in the development process. In India, the campaign to legitimize community radio began in the mid-1990s. Mr. P.J. Borua, the chief guest for today's occasion, have joined us. So I'd like to request the Vice Chancellor of Krishna Kanto Handik State Open University to kindly felicitate our chief guest with a Fulan Gamusa and a Japi. And for this purpose, I'd like to request Dr. Jury Hazarika to assist Vice Chancellor, sir. Thank you, sir. It is my privilege to introduce our speaker for today's occasion, Professor Vinod Pavarala. Vinod Pavarala is a senior professor of communication and UNESCO chair on community media at the University of Hyderabad. After obtaining a PhD degree in sociology from University of Pittsburgh, United States, Professor Pavarala taught at Virginia Tech, Blacksburg, United States, and Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay, before joining the University of Hyderabad in 1995. At the University of Hyderabad, he has held many positions, including as head, Department of Communication, Dean of the Sarojini Naidu School of Arts and Communication, Director of Office of International Affairs, and chaired important university-level committees like Chairman, NAC Steering Committee, and Chair, NEP Implementation Committee. His teaching and research have been mainly in the areas of communication for social change and community media. He has been actively involved in research, policy advocacy, and capacity building in the field of community media, not only in India and elsewhere in South Asia, but also in East and West Africa and parts of Europe. In 2022, he was a duo India visiting professor at Loughborough University in London. He has published several articles in scholarly journals and contributed book chapters to a number of edited volumes. Professor Pavarala currently chairs the Community Communication section of the International Association for Media and Communication Research. He serves on editorial boards of several reputed international journals and publishing houses, as well as on many academic bodies of higher education institutions in India and abroad. May I now take the opportunity to invite our guest, Professor Vinod Pavarala, to address the august audience with his words of wisdom, knowledge, experience.
Good morning. Honorable Vice Chancellor, the Registrar, and Dr. Sangeeta Kakoti, the entire Jnan Taranga team, Mr. P.J. Parwa, the Chief Guest. I'm really delighted to be here, and I deem it an honor and a privilege to be invited to the 12th anniversary of Northeast India's first community radio station. I'm sort of familiar with Jnan Taranga and have followed its career ever since its inception, and have coordinated and worked with others who are involved in the station from the beginning. In fact, in 2019, when the UNESCO chair, which I hold, did a project with the Election Commission of India on voter education and electoral literacy, Jnan Taranga was one of the 25 community radio stations nationally to participate in our project. So congratulations. And I really know, having been in this field for more than 25 years, how difficult and challenging it is to sustain a community radio station for this long. And for that, I think the credit goes to the entire production team, the management team, and I should also appreciate the university administration for sustaining this station continuously, providing it the support it deserves. So, having said that, so when I was invited to do this lecture, I decided that I'll share with you some of the global experiences of community radio working during the times of COVID-19. And as the UNESCO chair on community media, which is the only one of its kind globally, we managed to do quite a bit of tracking of how community radios were functioning during the pandemic. So I thought I'll share some of that with you. So the basic premise of community radio is that in order to develop and sustain a strong civil society where citizens have a say in development and social change, one needs to create some decentralized spaces that allow people the right to communicate and have access to the media. Across the world, social movements, non-governmental organizations, citizen action groups have struggled for decades to push their respective national governments to relax state controls of the airwaves and open them to communities. Community radios that have been characterized as media that provide a channel for other voices have historically amplified the voices of those who are unheard. And sometimes I find this cliche that many of us have used about the voiceless. As someone said, there is actually no one who is voiceless. It is that many of those voices are unheard. Yeah, so I would rather talk about them as unheard voices. Provide them a space to talk, sing, discuss their identities and problems, and articulate the possibilities of an alternative public sphere outside of the mainstream media. The COVID-19 pandemic that overwhelmed the world with the novel coronavirus claimed millions of lives and livelihoods in its wake, with countries in the global south disproportionately affected, by unequal access to medical and healthcare facilities, including vaccines developed by large multinational pharmaceutical giants in affluent countries. Even within the countries of the global south, existing social and economic inequalities further exaggerated uneven information flows. It is in this context that community radio stations around the world played a crucial role in addressing the concerns of the poor and deprived communities, many of them living in rural, in remote rural areas with little or no internet connectivity. So what I would like to share with you is the experiences of community radio stations in Asia, Africa, and Latin America in dealing with the pandemic. And much of this learning comes from a major initiative that we at the UNESCO chair took up during the pandemic. We organized a series of global dialogues on community media in the post-pandemic era, all done online. But we have done 11 different global dialogues across different regions of the world with about 75 participants from around the world, activists, producers, advocates of community media, scholars participating in that. And what I'm sharing with you today are kind of the lessons that we gleaned from those global dialogues. These were done during 2020, early 21. They're all available in our YouTube channel. Let me say a few things about community media, like community radio in the global south, before I get into the pandemic. Now, community media such as community radio, with its underlying participatory, communicative ethos, produced and managed by local communities, is a vital part of the media landscape globally. These media initiatives have proved to be invaluable as communicative infrastructures for the marginalized people during periods of natural disasters, public health crises. With empowerment of deprived communities as its main goal, community radio is particularly suited for addressing the needs of vulnerable sections of society as part of any country's strategies for disaster management. Especially during earthquakes and cyclones in South and Southeast Asia, community radios in the region have played a vital role in disaster risk reduction, relief, and rehabilitation of affected people. In other parts of the world as well, including Africa, Australia, the Caribbean, local communities have successfully demonstrated their communication capabilities to not only address issues in the immediate aftermath of a natural disaster, but also contribute to the building of climate resilient communities within the paradigm of sustainable development. Community radios are ideally suited for communication with communities and among communities during natural disasters or public health crises. Many community radios in the global south have been set up by civil society organizations that have a track record of intense engagement for decades with local communities on a range of civic issues and a development agenda, a social change agenda. Combined with this grassroots familiarity and sensitivity to the needs of local communities is the production process itself, which is a participatory production process where the programming is done by community members themselves rather than by professional broadcasters. Additionally, the information shared on community radios is content that is locally relevant and disseminated in local languages and dialects. In India, for example, although the Constitution of India formally recognizes about 22 languages, community radios in the country broadcast in a variety of languages, not included in that list, such as Santhali, Desiya, Kutchi, Bundeli. And here in Assam, if you look at a station like Radio Brahmaputra that broadcasts from Dibrugarh. They use the T tribe dialect or language, what you call it, Shadri. They broadcast in Bodo. They broadcast in Mishing. About 5 different languages, which are unheard of on radio waves before the advent of community radio. You can look at the extent of community radio and the role it has played across the global south. You can talk about Latin America, which is the crucible of community radio. In the 1940s, community radio actually started in the coal mines of Bolivia. So it's like the mother of community radios. A lot of active community radio work happens in Latin America, in Africa, where there is a long history of using radio for rural development. Even during the colonial period, countries like Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria have been deploying radio for dissemination of agricultural information for a long time, right? In Asia, not just in India, but also in our neighborhood, in Bangladesh, in Nepal, now in Bhutan, but also in Southeast Asia, countries like Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, community radio has a very significant presence. Now let me move from there to quickly share with you what happened during the pandemic, what these stations did during the pandemic across the global south. Community radio stations in India, Nepal and Bangladesh came up with a range of contributions during these tough times that proved without any qualms that community radio is not just about making radio. It is about serving communities and reaching the unreached. Through a combination of terrestrial broadcasting, social media, and personal engagement, the community radio stations in our region contributed to community awareness, preparedness, and participation, and served in very meaningful ways as a catalyst to combat the coronavirus pandemic in their respective countries. The stations demonstrated successfully that the essence of community radio lies in its localness. All broadcasts on COVID-19 were aired in the local languages and dialects. The content produced communicated clearly with people in their vernacular style and rural accents. Community radio stations introduced creativity and variety in their content, whether it was about airing folk songs, about themes like social distancing and isolation, or making COVID-19 vocabulary, which is complex enough for educated people, like, quarantine, lockdown, pandemic, physical distancing, hand hygiene, asymptomatic, PPE, vaccine. We have all learnt much in the last few years. Making such complex vocabulary comprehensible for listeners. The staff of community radio stations followed the prevalent protocols, many of them working from their homes, but that didn't stop them from mobilizing community responses and supporting the efforts by civil society organizations. As nations went under lockdowns, compelled to close their borders, impose restrictions, community radio stations continued to be on air, and I'm sure including Jnan Taranga here has done that kind of a service. We're on air supporting their listeners in very ingenious ways, broadcasting vital, verified and village level news in local languages through skits, songs, folk tales, and even through live phone-in programs, while making people participate. From furnishing judicious and timely information about COVID-19 to handling anxieties, from busting rumors, debunking misinformation and disinformation, to presenting quiz shows on the coronavirus, playing favorite song lists, and running school programs, especially when schools were shut down physically. So we have examples of this all over the region. In Bangladesh, something like 18 community radio stations They have only 18 stations. About 200 broadcasters, mostly young people and women, broadcast about 165 hours of educational content on the pandemic every day. Yeah, fresh content every day. In Nepal, in about 25 of the 77 districts where community radios function, they rose to the occasion splendidly to provide valuable local information in local languages to communities spread across a variety of geographical landscapes. In India, with over 300 community radio stations catering to rural deprived communities, many of them lived up to their commitment to marginalized sections of society by broadcasting information relevant to communities like migrant workers who were holed up in government-run quarantine stations, not knowing where to go, when to get out. A station in North India, not too far from the national capital region, took on disinformation and misinformation through special programs that dispelled various myths about the pandemic, that had taken on a life of their own through social media, WhatsApp forwards. Yeah, you know that story. You can see similar things in Southeast Asia, in countries like Indonesia, which has a long history of using community radios during disasters like earthquakes, during the famous tsunami. Community radio stations came together, broadcasting information on disaster preparedness, relief and rehabilitation. A lot of that experience came in very handy for Indonesian community radio stations during the pandemic. If you go to a place like Africa, where internet coverage is very minimal, right? And large numbers of sub-Saharan Africa are really cut off from the digital world, not much internet connectivity. It is in those parts of Africa that community radios played a very vital role, right? Because they operate on analog and with FM frequencies and so on. They played a very significant role. In South Africa, it was pointed out that the community radio broadcasters who are sort of all-in-one experts, they don't tend to be narrow specialists in one area or the other. They, that whole idea of doing all-in-one came in very handy during the COVID-19 situation, because the number of people at each station shrunk during COVID-19 period, right? So one or two people were managing to do everything at the radio station. In a country like Malawi, the community radios put in extra effort to interact with health experts, to introduce, to understand the complexity of the pandemic and suggested measures to tackle it and transmit that information in meaningful ways to various local contexts. In Kenya, many radio stations became schools on air, broadcasting educational curricular content on the radio. When children couldn't go to schools, when they didn't have connectivity to do online education, radio stations came in very handy in Kenya, continuing to educate children on air. The educational crisis caused by the coronavirus pandemic, the full story has not come out yet, but something like 11 million children in Kenya out of school created a real catastrophe in terms of educational objectives in a country like Kenya. And that's where community radio stations came in very handy. In Latin America, no survey of community radio in the global south would be complete without exploring the people-managed, citizen-controlled radios across Latin America. Latin America is no stranger to crises of all kinds, political crisis, social, economic, natural crisis during its long history. During the COVID-19 pandemic, these community radios in different parts of Latin America prioritized the situation of the most deprived communities in dealing with the crisis. In Brazil, for instance, where the president of the country, who now lost power, infamously led by denial and misinformation, community radio stations in Rio de Janeiro worked in the ghettos, in the favelas, through the mobilization of multiple tools like loudspeakers, posters, radio, and social media to provide messages of caution and prevention to its people. In Peru, where disinformation and conspiracy theories have led to very low uptake of vaccination, especially among indigenous communities, a station in the province of Nauta devoted a good part of its programming to receiving calls from community members, directing queries about vaccines to state authorities, and broadcasting authenticated information on COVID-19. One of the challenges was that much of the health department's audio messages that were made only in Spanish had to be translated into native indigenous languages. So similar work was done in countries like Nicaragua, where the dominant language is Spanish, but there were several other languages in which people speak every day, work every day. So they were constantly doing this translation work and disseminating this information. In a country like Chile, while I'm continuing in Latin America, despite being one of the more affluent countries in Latin America, less than half of rural households had a reliable connection at the beginning of the pandemic. It almost rendered it impossible to deliver online education effectively, even in a country like Chile, which is relatively well off compared to other countries in the region. A non-profit organization called Enseña Chile conceived of a program called La Radio Enseña to create radio content related to school curriculum and offered these lessons free to about 200 stations across the country, many of which were on community radios. So community radio came to the rescue of school education in a country like Bolivia as well. In the Amazon rainforest of Ecuador, far from any healthcare facilities, conveying information about COVID-19 vaccinations in the local Quechua language meant that isolated indigenous communities were brought into the communication loop for the first time during the pandemic. In Mexico, network of indigenous community radios came together to share content. Instead of working in silos individually, they started sharing content in local indigenous languages, giving authenticated medical and health information to its communities, and letting the communities ask questions of health experts and provide answers to that. If you look at Mexico, for example, some of the community radio stations in a region like Guadalajara focused attention on vulnerable groups that are disproportionately affected by the pandemic. For instance, let me give you one specific area. Forced to stay at home, women in Mexico, like in many other parts of the world, had to endure a rise in domestic violence and other forms of sexual and gender-based violence during the pandemic. As community media that work with marginalized communities, many stations in Mexico addressed the consequences of COVID-19, the lockdowns, etc., on women in particular. Right? So this is again a contribution that was made by community radio stations, and we didn't find similar things in mainstream media. So in conclusion, community radios in the global south have undoubtedly acted as major information channels during the COVID-19 crisis, especially for communities that are located at the far end of the development road, without access to healthcare facilities and the internet, and beyond the radar of mainstream metropolitan media. Despite a strong digital push globally and increasingly in the developing world, community radio stations, mostly operating in the analog mode, demonstrated their continued relevance to the poor and marginalized sections of populations of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. If proof was needed about the characteristics that make community radio a viable and necessary medium in the global south, their hyper-local focus, use of local and indigenous languages and dialects, locally relevant content, and participatory production processes, and so on. All of these characteristics of community radio were abundantly evident during the worldwide health crisis that we have witnessed over the last 2 years. Going beyond their immediate role in addressing the pandemic, we at the UNESCO Chair on Community Media have been raising a number of key questions, including questions like, what are the possibilities and constraints for community media in the post-pandemic world? What are the experiences of movements and networks in negotiating with governments on opening up third sector media? And when I say third sector media, I mean media not controlled by the government or by private corporations, a third sector media. Right? Does the state of civil society across the world give rise to optimism about the future of community media? Or should we be worried about the future of community media? Is there a need for reform or transformation within the community media sector to adapt itself to the post-pandemic world? Even as participants in the global dialogues that we conducted could not provide decisive answers to many of these questions, the emergent answers to these difficult issues caution us about not to romanticize community media such as community radio too much, ignoring the real constraints within which they must operate. Many of the community radio stations work with the help of volunteers in their stations, unpaid volunteers. Many of the community radio stations work with inadequate financial support, right? There is no powerful government or private companies behind them. The government provides some little funding, but it's not much. So it needs enormous amount of community goodwill and support to run and sustain these stations. The reason why I find it admirable that Jnan Taranga today is completing 12 years of its existence. In many countries of the global south, some of the countries I mentioned, community radios are yet to gain full legal recognition. And where they manage to obtain legislative mandate, like in India or in Bangladesh, where they are allowed legally, the community radio sector struggles for survival against the ravages of autocratic regimes in some countries, highly restrictive policies. For example, in India, community radio stations are not permitted to broadcast news. We are about 15 years old now, or maybe close to 20 if you look at the history of campus licensing. But community radio stations are still not allowed to broadcast news. And this in a digital age when people can get news at the push of a button on their mobile phones, community radios are the only media outlets that are still not allowed to broadcast news. That needs to open up. There is a case currently in the Supreme Court of India asking why community radios cannot broadcast news. Hopefully, the Supreme Court will come down in favor of free speech sooner or later. They cannot broadcast, the policy says, content of a political nature. That again, we don't know what that means. Yeah, and when you ask my friends in the ministry, what do you mean by political nature? They'll say, why don't stations do their job? We'll let you know when they go wrong. Yeah, and that's not really reasonable policy. It should be defined. Right? Of course, a lot of my friends in community radio movement say everything is political. Yeah, what is not political? Right? I mean, if you're talking about development, talking of social justice, empowerment of women, all of that is political also, right? But by right, as a media outlet, community radio stations should also be permitted to broadcast news or political content, right? A lot of stations do quite a bit of intelligent programming where they do local news, but they don't call it news. Yeah, I mean, they don't call it samachar and give it. But I don't think stations should be getting around the policy like this. They should have a right of access to news of all kinds. There are challenges of social and financial sustainability. In educational institutions, many students run radio stations, and as you all know, students come and go. And after 2 years, once students leave, a fresh batch comes, you have to train them again. Volunteers trained in community radio stations tend to leave, for higher education. People get married and move and so on. So there is a constant turnover of volunteers, and stations have to continuously train new set of people in radio. So that is the social sustainability. But there is also financial sustainability issues. Setting up a radio station is relatively easy. Yeah, I mean, if there are NGOs or educational institutions like your university, you can provide some seed funding and you can start the station. But how does one sustain the station? Yeah, pay some basic salaries, pay something minimally to volunteers, upgrading of equipment, content production, doing some field work. All of this requires financial sustainability. And financial sustainability has been a challenge that the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting has taken on, but it's not adequate, it's not continuous. So stations are still struggling for financial sustainability. And there is a gradual encroaching of the state and the corporate world on what I call the communication commons. Yeah, I mean, this is the electronic commons that belong to the people. There's a lot of encroachments happening with more and more corporations entering radio, for example. There are not many frequencies left for communities. If you go to some of the big cities, it's difficult to start new community radio stations because most of the frequencies have been taken over by the big corporations already. Right? So something is happening with the electronic commons, the airwaves. The Supreme Court of India in 1995 said airwaves are public property and must be used for public good. The airwaves are not private property. Yeah? And more encroachments in this public property are beginning to happen, and as responsible citizens and civil society, we should be guarded about it. If the performance of community radio stations during the ongoing pandemic is assessed objectively, one can emphatically assert that the millions of deprived people in the global south who are caught up in a vicious cycle of inequalities can truly find their voices through community radio. Thank you. Thank you.